Greetings class, Professor Steve here, with the lesson on what's essentially our last few trophic levels in the heterotrophic consumer group. So the previous lecture was on the primary herbivores in the ocean, the guys that are primarily responsible for eating the phytoplankton, who are the primary producers. Uh, and all the rest of these guys in this lesson are essentially those trophic levels. Just above them, they either eat those herbivores or are eaten by somebody above them, and we'll cover examples of all those groups very quickly here. So there's an entire group of consumers that are just above, say, the copepods, the krill, but they've also known to eat phytoplankton as well, which makes them herbivores and predators, or you could call them omnivores, right? And there are a few different classes of these guys, but one of the main ones is a group called the pteropods. P is silent in that word. These guys are relatively small. They're less than a centimeter, so they're smaller than krill. They range from, millimeters to a centimeter. And they're a gastropod. They're in the gastropod family, which the closest living relative that you would recognize is a snail. So they have these little shells that they make, usually out of silicon, or I believe there are some that make like a calcium carbonate shell. But these guys are active predators. As small as they are, they fly through the water and track down, capture, and intercept food particles. And again, those are mainly other copepods or other critters, but including some phytoplankton. The next group up from them, and these guys pretty much trap everything that we've talked about so far. Mostly the consumers that we've talked about so far, but they'll get phytoplankton. They'll inadvertently get some protozoa and bacteria and that kind of thing, but they're not a major food source to them. They're kind of accidental. And these are the larger jelly consumers. uh, there's an entire group in the family in the phylum Cnidaria. I call them Cnidarians. And essentially all these fall into what you would call a jellyfish. There are some very small ones ranging on the order of centimeters, and there are some very large ones all the way up to the range of meters. Some of them live colonially, but they use their tentacles and the pumping of water and pulsing of their um, medusa umbrella here to fly through the water, glide through the water. And they use their tentacles to trap pretty much everything in their path. This other group we call Ctenophores. These guys are on the order of centimeters as well. They only get up to be about 20 centimeters, so not quite as big as these guys, but these are active, again, gliding. Generic name for them is comb jellies. And they glide through the water and they intercept particles. They consume a lot of lower level heterotrophs, so the copepods, the krill, and everything below them. Another group of heterotrophic consumer up above the main herbivores, or at least I should say a very specific example is a Ctenophores, also known as an arrowworm. And these guys could be tens of millimeters, so under a centimeter to a couple of centimeters long. And they're kind of strange looking, but you can see how they're shaped kind of like an arrow, and they dart through the water. And the reason I point this group out is because they really are a very principal predator. Their primary prey is the copepod, and since the copepod is so numerous and eats the majority of phytoplankton and makes up the largest amount of combined mass on Earth out of all organisms, that makes the Ctenophores a very important link between copepods and the next levels up and transferring energy and carbon up in the food chain. And it's estimated that they can eat as much as 30% of global copepods. So after these guys, after the few that we just covered, which kind of fall into basically the same categories, we start really getting into what are the active predators, or the larger consumers, um, essentially the things that we're relatively familiar with, such as filter feeding fishes, which are mainly herbivores. They go after large chain phytoplankton, but they also go after copepods and smaller consumers, the things that eat phytoplankton. Um, things like shad and the alewife, um, sardines, and herring. These are large schooling fish. They eat so much of their primary productivity that they reproduce very heavily, and the reason and produce large schools and large populations, and and they're important in that way because they're actually very important in commercial fisheries, right? We harvest herring and sardines for food and for medicinal purposes, for flavorings, for hygiene products. Have a lot of byproduct from these kinds of things. Um, and believe it or not, this guy here, the whale shark, falls into that same category as filter feeding fish, right? The whale shark is gigantic. It's 12 meters in length, but this is one of these seagoing predators that's not really an active predator, but they just swim through the water with their mouth open, continually filtering water, and whatever gets in their path, they kind of consume. So any of the fishes like these guys are way too maneuverable and too fast to get trapped by these guys. So they're essentially trapping plankton. So in essence, a guy in this group is really playing the same role as a filter feeding protozoa, or or even a copepod, where they're just filtering out the water column of all tiny planktonic organisms. Same thing goes with the basking shark, a little bit smaller than the whale shark, but still quite large. And these guys just trawl through the water with their giant filter mouths open, and their gills act as rakes, as filters, and they just sieve as much plankton as possible, enough to keep this large organism going. And then the next step up in filter feeders is not a fish, but a mammal, and those are the baleen whales. This is a picture of the blue whale, which is the largest uh, animal on our planet, thought to be extinct up until a few decades ago. But we now know that there are a number of them around. But they're not the only ones. There's the humpback whales, the right whales, any of the whales that are baleen whales. They go around opening their gigantic maws. They swallow a lot of water, then they filter it out past their uh, teeth-like structures, but they're not teeth. They're called baleen, and they act as giant filters. And they'll trap just about everything that's in that water, small fish. But they're usually primarily after krill. Krill makes up the largest portion of their diet. Um, you saw in that krill video that the krill form these gigantic swarms, and they reproduce at tremendous rates, and there's tons of them. And so these guys track in on those swarms, and they'll swallow entire swarms at once. And that's the only thing that can sustain such a large body. Um, so now we get into the real predators, which essentially are game fish. These fish that actively hunt things like we've covered before, such as smaller fish primarily. Some of these will go after some of the larger, lower level heterotrophs like krill or shrimp, or um, this kind of thing. Some of the smaller gelatinous guys maybe, but mostly they're hunting smaller fishes and crustaceans and things of that nature. Something like the salmon, the cod, anything in the tuna family, and the list kind of goes on and on. Swordfish, sailfish. Uh, so the, um, and then next up on the list is predatory mammals. So these are the guys that eat the bigger fish. Some of them range down to the smaller fish as well, but they eat the bigger fish, such as the cod and that kind of thing. And we're really familiar with these guys, seals and sea lions. Um, some of the smaller whales and dolphins, relatives of each other, cetaceans, right? The beluga whale, dolphins. Right, and then next after them comes the very top predators. Um, such as the predatory, very carnivorous types of whales like the orca whale, or what people like to call sometimes the killer whale. Um, and then much larger, but in the same class, is the sperm whale. And these guys tend to hunt and capture even the largest of other predators, seals and sea lions. Not very often something like a dolphin, but a lot of the larger fishes. Um, uh, Sperm whales in particular are known for hunting giant squid at very deep depths in the ocean. And then, of course, there's the guys that eat everything, such as our friend Bruce here, great white shark, pretty much the pinnacle predator. And nothing really eats these guys or can eat something of this nature, making them the top predator, except, of course, humans. Right? Humans find a way to outsmart just about everything and consume just about everything on every trophic level, and put it to some sort of use, anything that's of benefit to us, right? So that really ends it for the groups of heterotrophs, and our discussion of heterotrophic organisms, or at least the examples of them and what they do. And in the benthic lecture later, next unit, we'll talk about a couple of different examples, but which really fill the same niches. And then between the end of this lecture and the end of that benthic unit, we'll really start to put together the importance of all this consumption and recycling of organic matter and what the implications for those are and what it means for the energy flow on the planet. Thanks for joining me. See you next lesson.